Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining our Secure Access to Your On-Prem and Hybrid Systems webinar with Okta, presented today by Kevin Butler. So just some quick housekeeping. So during the webinar, everybody will be muted, but you will be able to ask any questions in the questions window on the right, which will be presented to Kevin at the end of the session. The webinar will be recorded after the session, and this will be shared with everybody. So you've got that to look forward to. And lastly, we have got a feedback form at the end. If you could please complete this for us, that would be great, as we use this to ensure that our webinars are still hitting the mark. So quick agenda for today before I hand over to Christian. So Christian will be going through the Bytes intro and a bit about us and Okta, and then he'll introduce and hand over to today's speaker, Kevin, who will go through the bulk of the presentation, covering Okta's easy integration with middleware or database servers, how to implement modern security for on-prem apps, cost and operational burden reduction using Okta's Access Gateway. We'll then go into our Q&A. And with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Christian.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. And Michael, can you just confirm you can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Good morning, all. Thank you very much for joining this morning. By way of a quick introduction, I guess, my name is Christian Sullivan. I'm part of the security team here at Bytes. My role is to specialize in identity vendors, do product demonstrations, and help account managers and their customers have a deeper understanding of solutions. Now, I hope you all know about Okta and what Bytes do in the security field, but for those of you who don't, I will explain very quickly. So I will pick on the top left and also the bottom right categories to give you that flavor. Our cyber consulting division is run by our CISO, Steve Marshall, and his wider team who have decades of experience. Their aim is to service and help organizations achieve accreditations. If your business is thinking about it, it is certainly worth a conversation. And if you do have any questions about this, then please do direct them towards your account manager, who will be delighted to help. The other category I will pick on is the security advisory in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, this is run by my team and my wider team, security. And what we're able to do here is offer free workshops. Now, the result of this is that you will get a document at the end containing multiple areas that we have covered with you. Now, whether you choose to bring this back to the business or just to keep for yourself, to keep track of what is going on within the security space and any holes that may need to be filled, it's entirely up to you. There's no obligation or cost associated to this. This is something that is run by our team to help you get that insight. Now, a little bit about Bytes. We are a partner that can be trusted. As you can see, we are no stranger to accreditations, which you can see on the left-hand side of my screen. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see we're no stranger to partner awards either. Now, when it comes to awards, they do not tend to just revolve around the amount of business that is done. And what I will do is pick on Okta here, which is only fitting. You can see here that we have been the winners of the UK and Ireland Partner of the Year, and more proudly, which was about 3 weeks ago, we were given EMEA Partner of the Year, as well as Pre-Sales Partner of the Year. What this, I hope, would show you is that we are very skilled in Okta, both on a pre-sales and business level. So being one of 2 elite partners in the UK, we can help you commercially with that pricing advantage, but also give you all the resource you require to have a better understanding of how Okta can fit into your organization. Now, I'll stop there, and Kevin, I will hand over to you.
Hi, good morning. Yes, so good morning. Yes, my name is Kevin Butler. I'm a solutions engineer from Okta, and happy to be presenting this webinar for yourselves and Bytes this morning, and we're going to be covering securing access to on-premise hybrid systems. So you mentioned certification there. I'm a certified Okta consultant. There's various examinations we go through. The partners also do the same ones, and I've also been a CISP for the past 12 years. So identity and access management is something I've been doing for quite a while. And we need to move the screen. So hybrid IT. So this is really the key area of one of the core challenges at present for many organizations. In the ultimate world, everything would be pure cloud these days if everything's going to be cloud, but we have a lot of heritage and legacy environments that came from the on-premise environments. And that's where, for those of us who've been working in the IT industry a while, that's where the systems all grew up in the first place, and that's where the majority of certainly large-scale enterprise identity is coming from. For newer organizations, they can take the advantage of cloud services, and many organizations are trying to move towards the cloud environment for cost reasons, accessibility and various other reasons. But the reality is, as we see here, 69% of organizations are actually running what we class as a hybrid organization, where there's a mix of pure on-premise equipment and services and apps through to a mix of pure cloud services and capability. And certainly in the recent times, the last 6 months with the COVID driving much more remote access, the hybrid world has become more significant, certainly. So what's the challenges? Hybrid IT is actually complicated, partly because the heritage local apps. So if we look at the bottom layer of this, we've got various components, resources, and some people still are working in offices, although many people have moved into working remote or a mix between the two. So previously it used to be about 20% remote, whereas we're seeing probably, certainly in lockdown periods, 90 plus percent, or even 99% back in March of people working remotely. So the IT infrastructure has to adapt and cope. And that meant for a large number of people, they were coming in through DMZs, rapid increase in VPN requirements. And certainly from an Okta point of view, we saw a high demand in that area and change. Also the adoption of cloud services. So for some people, these unique events that have happened to us were driving more of the change. But for most organizations, it's a journey to actually do the hybrid environment. So they have to be able to plan the refresh and the uplift of applications. Some application refresh cycles there are 2 to 5 years, depending on what's going on. Some technologies that have been adopted a good while back are just not being updated by the appropriate vendors. They're producing new services. So for instance, HR is a good example. It used to be on-prem purely. Vast number of organizations are now moving that HR functionality out into the cloud, whether that be Workday, SuccessFactors, or some of the other cloud-based HR systems. We've seen that same change for email and office productivity tools going out to the likes of Office 365 and G Suite. So it's all about the journey, but there are some apps and services that just can't be moved straight off, and they're supported by some legacy on-prem equipment and services. So this is what we're really going to talk about. As I say, where did that really come from? Well, if you take the history, and we're only talking 5-10 years back, as I say, email, CRM, ERP, and various other things are all on-prem. They're moving to the cloud slowly but surely. But there are some services that people don't want to move or don't trust the cloud fully yet. So sensitive document storage, various other things. There's whatever the mechanism is, there's a need now to be able to do that. But you look at your actual, local area network service control, AD on premise. It's been there for a good number of years, 20 plus years, and now trying to move identity out to the cloud is proving quite a challenge. But this is where Okta came in 10 years ago. Okta is born in the cloud, built in the cloud, and we're actually addressing that challenge as we go with more and more organizations. But on-prem may not be just a real data center. It could be hosted in a cloud service. So you've actually got now cloud data centers, but they still use the same components. Some people try to do a straight lift and shift, going from physical machines to virtual machines in the cloud. Great. But you still the same challenges that those on-prem environments could be inside the organization. The expectation was large numbers of users are on the inside, and now large numbers of users are on the outside, and we want to exchange with partners, we want to exchange with collaborators, those core capabilities from a business delivery point of view, but they need to be supported by infrastructure and sets of services. And that infrastructure, again, a combination of physical and logical, takes time, money, and effort to maintain. That's where the real challenge comes from. So we actually look at from transforming the on-premise infrastructure. So with Okta as a whole, we've moved into the cloud. One of the challenges is how do we actually address the remaining applications that are left on site, on premise? So Okta Access Gateway is our most recent solution set capability, and it extends the Okta Identity Cloud down into the on-premise environment and allows us to apply Okta single sign-on and MFA policies, or modern authentication as we like to call it, which can be applied in front of those traditional on-premise apps. So the old ERP systems, the older HR systems, business control systems that were all typically running on Java J2E environments. And you want to strengthen the authentication on that, and quite rightly so, to enable remote users to gain access to it. So just a little bit more detail on that. As I say, a lot of the focus, particularly for Okta Access Gateway as a solution component, as part of the bigger hybrid IT solution set for web access management or web applications, these came from those traditional tools that are on-prem. As you see here, we've actually got the likes of SiteMinder, Oracle, IBM, Novell, Ping, ForgeRock, number of names there that come to mind. They're all providing the traditional on-premise web access management solution. And this was giving you header-based authentication to those traditional enterprise apps. So those apps, as I say, would typically be run in J2E environment, and then you'd pass header information across. The apps would trust the single sign-on service as far as the identity of the user is concerned, but it meant you could switch between multiple apps from a user experience point of view, and the users had to use a single ID. Those users were typically in the office environment or via a VPN. So that because there was multiples of those to provide service, you'd have load balancer in front of that. But fundamentally, the mechanism was it's a web-based app. And if we look at the components that are in the bottom of those, typically those add-ons are things like, over a period of time, it's single sign-on first, then it was multi-factor authentication, and then federation came along and says, well, actually, you don't need to force users to log in every time. And then we have administrator side of it and configuration elements that drive things like the admin UI and the databases. Add Okta to the mix. So Okta can be used as a cloud service and helps to do the federation out to those cloud services. And then as an on-prem experience, as more and more of those get adopted, users become familiar with the single sign-on and the MFA services that Okta, as an integration platform, can actually provide capability. And allows you to migrate those MFA and single sign-on and federation services into the cloud to be actually delivered from that perspective. So how do we actually then deal with what's left behind if we've actually modernized and uprated into federation and MFA and single sign-on services in the cloud? What's left is the on-prem footprint of what's left of the web access management solution. And that typically is the single sign-on part, i.e. the part that does the header-based authentication, plus its configuration, plus its platforms. So if we take just a bit more detail look at that, there's an ongoing cost, and this is where one of the key advantages of doing that journey migration is the cost benefit to realize and reduce the expense of running on-premise equipment. It's part of a bigger picture for larger organizations to move away from on-prem dedicated data centers into virtualized data centers and services. The platforms these run on typically are older equipment. They need renewing every period of time. The actual support services and updating and patching has to happen at the operating system level, at the database level, at the middleware level, at the single sign-on software itself. So they require a certain amount of investment in terms of FTEs or even partner work activity to maintain this and keep them up to date. And the more security issues that are found with it, the more often you have to do that. So really the plan here is to try and move those up. And this is all part of that bigger application refresh cycle. As I say, a lot of applications go through a refresh cycle of somewhere between 2 and 5 years. And from a business perspective, if you're moving those applications up into a cloud-based service, then that deprecates the platform. So ultimately, you're trying to do that. But there's a stepping stone in between. So some of those apps could take a long time to do that. Whereas today, you want to get single sign-on and adaptive MFA policies in front of those apps as quick as possible to support remote working. So this is where, again, the Okta Access Gateway comes into its own unique capability. So quick side, Gartner, 80% of organizations will have just moved into a hybrid environment or be forced into moving into a hybrid environment. That's probably speeded up a bit in the past year, but certainly we're halfway through that 4-year cycle that Gartner was on about a target 2022, where cloud-based IDaaS will be the chosen delivery method for the vast majority of corporate and enterprise systems. So that leads to one identity provider for everything. And this is where Okta comes into it. We provide Okta in the middle. Okta provides, as I say, all those services, very quick and easy to plug and play through the Okta integration network to the likes of Office 365, Okta Workday, all the other cloud services that are there. There's a significant number of them these days that are available. And typically they can be set up and spun up very quickly. And that's one of the attractions of it. You don't have to spend time building platforms, don't have to be updating operating systems, you don't have to be updating the apps. The cloud services are there on a subscription basis just to consume as it is, so you can focus on your business needs through those applications. Equally, you can share those out to remote partners, collaborators, and extend the reach and the accessibility of that. And that's one of the key things about this, is you're extending that reach and capability while actually maintaining the security profile about it. And we do that again through the addition there of Okta from a cloud point of view, does that, but there's the reach back into the on-prem. So the first example of that was, for instance, when you first set up Okta, you have an AD agent because 98% of organizations have AD as their primary user authentication. So it makes sense to be able to focus on that. Some applications in the legacy side could be LDAP based. So there is an LDAP agent that allows you to do that from that perspective as well. But that doesn't help with the actual single sign-on access into the applications. So the key thing here is that what Okta Access Gateway does is it provides a bridgehead and a link between the internet world and the on-prem world to those on-prem based applications. So in the past, only the on-prem employees could gain access to those apps, but they couldn't actually make use of, for instance, the single sign-on MFA, so there'd be a separate login experience as well. So what we're actually saying is by deploying Okta Access Gateway in front of the apps, we can then move the users over to a modern and secure user experience and enhance the actual secure front door security into those traditional legacy and heritage apps. Good example we've got here is Oracle E-Business Suite, as I say, one of those sort of well-known J2E type environments. By using Okta Access Gateway in front of it, we can now actually put the Okta login experience in front. So combinations there about user-friendly, it can be branded, but the user's familiar with it and trusts it as a single experience. If you've got multiple login screens, that kind of throws some users off, change the experience. Is it really their side? Is it not? But by doing that, we can enhance that security by adding in multi-factor authentication or adaptive multi-factor authentication. So OAG supports SSO and the adaptive multi-factor authentication capabilities all the way into including passwordless. So we can support MFA with the likes of Okta Verify, the FIDO2, so WebAuthn. We can now support things like Touch IDs for Macs, Windows Hello for Business, plug-in keys, whether it's UV keys, ePass keys, anything that supports the WebAuthn FIDO2 mechanism. Or we can still support the traditional RSA tokens and everything that's done through a Radius connection from that perspective. So again, we can support the migration of MFA services just from a generic Okta perspective, but the OAG can support that into those traditional apps. Let's see, Touch ID, modern devices, people want to make use of that. And very recently, we've now got things like Touch ID on iOS 14 coming with the prospect. We're just waiting for Apple to release the latest version of their software that works in the WebAuthn side. It works with Touch ID and Face ID and Windows Hello for Business on desktops, but this is more at the mobile and the iPad level. We're just waiting for that to come in. When that does come in, it's there, plug and play, ready to go. So this is all part of providing that future-proof platform. The platform can grow with you. You can extend hybrid cloud. You can support multiple clouds. You can very much do workforce administration on this, but it's equally capable of doing for B2B and also customer focused. So although OAG seems to be focused on those traditional apps, from an integration perspective, what we're talking about here applies both in workforce, B2B and customer environments. And we've got example customers already having done that sort of mix and match, where very modern examples on mobile devices working through to back-end application services that are sitting on those traditional platforms. So how do we actually make this work? Drill in a bit more on the technical front, specific to Okta Access Gateway. But the key thing is it's a new offering from Okta. It's the first on-prem based capability. As emphasized already, the core capabilities it provides are single sign-on policy and MFA or adaptive MFA, for the applications that are protected by the OAG to enable access. The access is enabled using a reverse proxy technology, so it's built as an appliance, and in that appliance is a fully managed set of software from the operating system through to the Nginx reverse proxy capability, and then you've had, on top of that, you've got the OAG control mechanisms and the application management, which we'll see a bit later. But the whole package is deployable as a virtual appliance model, so it's fairly straightforward and simple. It can be deployed into multiple different types of platforms. So it was initially released with VMware ESXi in OVA format. That OVA can be imported into AWS. We now supply a VHD version to run in Azure, and we're working on Google Cloud Platform, and we've just most recently released Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. So what does this actually give us? So one of the key questions that come out of this is, what does it give us and what does it not give us? So if you take the whole Okta solution set as a whole for hybrid IT, this is a good summary slide, really. And we have a set of applications, SaaS applications, which you'll be familiar with. Those all use authentication of either typically SAML, OpenID Connect, could be WS-Fed, and some of them could actually be secure web authentication, i.e. forms fill. But really, we're not talking about form fill here. What we're really trying to talk to is the using stronger authentication processes. And the applications that can actually be worked directly with Okta should be. So if you've got on-premise applications, one of the things to look at is, does the application support modern-based authentication? In other words, does it support SAML? Does it support OpenID Connect or OAuth or WS-Fed? In which case, work with Okta directly on that. You don't need the Okta Access Gateway. The Okta Access Gateway is only really needed when those applications are using traditional header-based authentication. So on the right-hand side, header-based authentication, we supply that header-based values. We mimic the web access management authentication capability that that application is using today, assuming it's been configured to support that web app application. On a lot of the sort of older J2E type environments could actually typically have a configuration button of internal users and external users. External users usually meant header-based authentication. The other final option there is Windows-based, integrated Windows-based Kerberos. So for those that are working in a confined Microsoft environment and have got custom apps, then those can actually be authenticated in the same way. That's where OAG really comes into it. What OAG doesn't do is things like provisioning. Provisioning is covered by the likes of Skin protocol or the OPP agent for division, but the vast majority of apps are probably going to be taking their users from Active Directory or an LDAP environment. So we've got both Active Directory and LDAP agents that are used to manage those sets of users from that perspective. So from a network point of view, we can cover Radius and LDAP, as I've mentioned. The other part of hybrid IT connectivity is servers. Now, this is another capability, which I'm not covering in detail today, but it's advanced server access, and it's part of that wider set. And it's typically discussed in zero trust initiatives, where you're wanting to provide the single sign-on experience that you get across the rest of the Okta platform, but for gaining access to servers. And those are your server fleets, so typically your Linux and Windows fleets that are running websites and applications, be they modern fleets in cloud services, which are dynamic and large scale, or the more traditional fixed sets of services in there. But what we're offering here is the ability to connect to those services using RDP and SSH, using ephemeral certificates, so short-term credentials. You log into Okta using your user ID and credentials, you then get allocated just like any other app. Allocated to the app. As part of that allocation in the app, then the advanced server access provisions specifically a mapping between your account and the named accounts available to those servers for login services, and uses those ephemeral keys. So we're not sharing, we're not doing password vaulting and other mechanisms. We are using a very secure short-term certificate. So think of it a bit like SSH, but it's certificate-based and it's short-term. So you don't have the challenges of fixed keys or keys being shared in an environment, which is really a bad thing to be doing. Finally, in the middle there, we see custom apps. So again, custom apps come into a wide range of services. If those apps support OpenID Connect or SAML or OAuth, then they should be working directly with Okta from an identity provider point of view. Some of those apps may come through API gateways, for instance. So again, Okta can work with those API gateways and services. And this is where the difference is between Okta Access Gateway. Okta Access Gateway is purely focused at the web SSO side of things. If we're talking about mobile access and reaching API-driven or REST API-driven mechanisms, then the chances are an API gateway is the better approach to doing this. So just wanted to clarify what Okta Access Gateway does, what it doesn't do, and how we can actually address those other challenges from a common perspective. So backing up a bit, we end up with Okta Access Gateway providing services to ERP, HR, those traditional apps. The more modern apps sitting in your environment will be talking directly to Okta from a perspective of even mobile apps through potentially more modern infrastructure and services. So those are sets of services that have already done the migration. What we're talking about here, go back to Okta Access Gateway, is how to facilitate the journey from those traditional on-prem apps and facilitate the user journey first, and then allow the actual management of the apps in the background over a period of time. So, mentioned earlier, key point is traditionally it was on-prem apps for just users in the office, few remote users, whereas today we're driven into the situation there's a lot more remote users, and we're probably sharing and collaborating a lot more and enabling a lot more supply chain. So if you think of a supply chain environment, Okta Access Gateway is just as equal and good solution in that environment as it is on a pure workforce. And as I say, you could even do this on a consumer basis as well. So we can cover all different angles. Driving into that a bit more detail, how does it really work? So what actually happens is that you have your Okta environment already deployed, you've got your users already available, they can log into those cloud services and various other things. Before deploying Okta Access Gateway, when they access these enterprise apps, then those enterprise apps will use a different login experience, may or may not have multi-factor authentication and the other checks that are done by the Okta service when primary login. So to be able to enable that to happen, we have to present the apps in Okta as a SAML-based app. And that's what Access Gateway actually does. So that when you first deploy Access Gateway, it creates a back connection to Okta through an API, and then we configure each of the applications on the Access Gateway, and that Access Gateway template creates the applications in Okta just like any other SAML-based application. So from an administration point of view, it looks exactly the same. You assign users to the app, you apply single sign-on policies to the app, you apply MFA policies to the app in exactly the same way once the app is actually available. What the Access Gateway is then doing when a user actually logs in is translating a SAML assertion. So when a user attempts to log in, if they've not got a session, you access the gateway redirects back to Okta. We get a login experience exactly the same as we would do for the likes of approaching going to Office Direct, Salesforce Direct, various others. They all redirect back to Okta as an IDP. The user then logs in based upon the sign-in policy, the MFA policy, and assuming the user is assigned to it, valid, and authenticates and passes the various checks, the user gets issued with a SAML assertion. That then redirects the user back to the Access Gateway. The Access Gateway consumes that SAML assertion and then takes that SAML assertion information and converts it into header-based information. So the Access Gateway has a policy per application that says take this set of parameters, effectively they're coming from Universal Directory in Okta relating to the user, telling the application that the user has passed authentication through Okta, so that the user is already authenticated before any traffic is passed through the gateway. We then pass the information to the enterprise app for its own internal authorization. So header-based authorization, header-based authentication is saying the user is already authenticated, but here's the additional details about the user. So typically it's email, first name, last name, and group information. Those are typically the sort of values that are sent across. And I'm going to show you a demonstration of that in a few minutes. Once that's actually done, then the app trusts that information. And that's how existing web application services actually work. The web application management does exactly the same thing. It authenticates the user, possibly against AD or LDAP, and then says to the app, yes, user's authenticated, and here's the authorization information. So all that Access Gateway is doing is mimicking exactly what the web access management solution is doing, and then the actual applications trust it. The benefit here is that there's very little configuration, if any, to be done on the actual apps themselves, because we can actually set the configuration for the header value pairs, name value pairs, to mimic the mechanism it uses today and trusts. So that should be fairly straightforward. Exactly the same thing happens in Kerberos. The only addition is that the Access Gateway and the app have to be registered within the Kerberos environment, and we map users to the Kerberos environment, and the Access Gateway acts as a reverse proxy within the Kerberos environment as well. So we get to that situation now where we can actually now apply the same policies for all apps, whether it's our cloud-based apps, on-premise, or combinations. We can take full advantage of the various services that are provided behind the Okta login box. So things like threat insights and other protective levels at the network level through the friendly login experience, the help links, the ability there to do password reset recovery. The actual user credentials are coming just like they are elsewhere, typically potentially from AD or Okta mastered, or it could be LDAP. Those are sort of the major combinations that people tend to use. And then we apply additional policies on top of that. So the adaptive policies, adaptive MFA and adaptive SSO policies can be applied. And as I say, we've got then the option of allowing users to use stronger passwordless authentication approaches with the likes of Okta Verify Push, FIDO2, Touch ID, Face ID, whatever we want. And those are done to enable access. And then that strengthens the actual access to the cloud services, and therefore would allow you to potentially trust providing access to the application direct rather than through a VPN. Because today, a lot of organizations use the trust in the VPN, but once it's into the VPN, it can go anywhere. So there's a real danger there that if people actually start using wide scale use of VPNs for single app access in a B2B environment or something of that nature, then the VPN approach is very costly. So again, we can do VPN reduction using Okta Access Gateway. So from a user experience perspective, we've got the ability to support both identity provider initiated and service provider initiated. By that, we mean, do we go to Okta first, then to the app, or do we go to the app, which goes to Okta, back to the app? So in the case of identity provider, we create the apps through the SAML wizard on the Access Gateway administrator. That appears as an app, and then it gets allocated. The user's allocated by group or individual. They appear with a chiclet on their portal, and they can click on that chiclet. That then takes them through to the app on the assumption that they're already authenticated. If the app requires additional MFA, then that's triggered at that point, and we then land onto the app from that point of view. You also notice that we're actually handling the change of DNS names. So quite a lot of internal apps will have an internal DNS name. And through the Okta Access Gateway, we can actually support the translation of that to an external. The external address has to be an internet valid DNS name, whereas internal names quite often are purely internal that are not referenceable on the outside. So we can address that from that perspective, and we can do that mapping through Okta Access Gateway. In reverse, similar type thing, if the user goes direct to the app, in fact, they hit the Okta Access Gateway. The Okta Access Gateway will challenge them and say, have you got a SAML assertion for this already? If yes, they're logged in, it'll be generated automatically. If the user's not logged in with a session, then they'll be redirected back to Okta, go through the login process, again, apply the per app single sign-on and MFA policies that are defined for that particular group of users, mechanisms, and then the user gets issued on the assumption that they're valid, gets issued with the SAML assertion and redirected back to the app and gains access to it from that perspective. Here you see that the user is internal, sitting on the office, they're going to an app, that's then redirecting out to Okta through their internet connection, they get the assertion, comes back, and then it goes back to the app with the appropriate access. So we can support both those types of environments. So what does this really give us? So it's part of that hybrid IT mechanism and journey. One of the key things we want is obviously benefits, and the key benefits you get here is reducing costs. We've discussed improving security already, and ultimately you're wanting to actually deprecate the use of on-prem platforms. So I'm just going to take a couple of slides to look into that in more detail and see where the cost benefits come from. Key one is reducing that infrastructure for the traditional web access management. So traditional web access management from a hybrid IT point of view, as we mentioned earlier, we've moved from having on-prem, say MFA, on-prem federation, we've moved that up to Okta. So those particular components are effectively can be deprecated if they're not used. The MFA, as I say, transitioned, but some of these could be a transition over time. And that's where, again, the Okta Access Gateway, you could actually run these in parallel and slowly migrate until all the apps are moved off the traditional. And then that area in the red, you can actually look to reduce considerably. And what surprises a lot of people, if you're not aware of it, is how complicated and significant some of these web access management environments are. You probably expect the apps, so your HR app, ERP app, to have multiple app platforms, load balancers, various other bits and pieces to provide high availability. Well, web access management has to do exactly the same thing, as does on-prem MFA, as does on-prem federation. Therefore, the sets of servers you're managing and maintaining and providing support costs and running all mount up. And certainly significant numbers of these servers are, have traditionally been used quite a lot. All of these are getting older. There's the potential of them coming out of date or not supported completely by modern and up-to-date versions of software. So all of these areas are key things. So what we can do from an Okta perspective with the Okta Access Gateway is collapse the main part of that middleware and data section into a set of reverse proxies with load balancers, and using modern virtualized versions of gateways, we can actually reduce that dependency and therefore reduce the amount of time, effort, and focus on the business side of things going on. The apps themselves, as I say, haven't been changed. That's a separate subject for onward journey. Maybe it's migration from that on-prem app into a cloud environment, but again, that could take a while to do. In the meantime, you want to supply or apply single sign-on and MFA to support collaboration, B2B, whatever the business driver is. This is where the Okta Access Gateway really comes into its own. So from some cost summaries, key things is collapsing that infrastructure to cloud services will reduce your reliance on the on-prem, therefore reduce your footprint. You don't have to keep those servers, and in particular, providing high availability and failover. So these days, Okta is now providing a 99.99% SLA for larger organizations. Trying to build your own on-premise capability to maintain that high level of serviceability takes a lot of kit and a lot of multiple data center mechanisms. So if you can reduce the cost of running that, the maintenance is another key area. Using the soft appliance model, so in Okta Access Gateway, there's a very simple monthly update, and that software applies to the whole appliance, the operating system, the Nginx, the OAG components, everything inside it is all self-contained and managed on a monthly update, and it's very quick to do. So therefore, reducing that sort of maintenance window and needs. There is a need for multiple OEGs, because it's on-prem, as I mentioned, you still need to and want to provide that high availability and failover, but there's a reduced dependency on infrastructure specialists and other services, but you're still going to need network guys, you're still going to need DNS, network management, and load balancing, various other services that you use today in a DMZ, secure DMZ environment, but it does reduce rather than expand. The other key benefit that comes out of it is the administrator experience, keeping it simple. And this is one of the sort of real benefits from an existing Okta Access or Okta tenant perspective, is the ability to do this. So there have been ways to do header-based authentication with other mechanisms, but they've become quite involved. You could deploy your own Apache reverse proxies, put components on it, and then try plug in modules for header-based auth on a per application basis. But then you end up creating custom apps in Okta manually, and the management side of it. So if you're going to start doing this for 50 to 100 apps, you want something that's fairly simple and straightforward. And that's where the administration for Okta Access Gateway comes in. It's template-driven policies. There's a admin app on OEG itself, which is one of the first apps that you set up. You set it up with a SAML authentication and just treat it like any other SAML app. You can do single sign-on and MFA for your administrators. That connects to Okta seamlessly from an app point of view. So it does a back API connection and allows you to do configuration of apps using a template walkthrough. And for those apps that are actually listed, there's a list of Oracle apps and various others that have got templates on them with Microsoft mechanisms there as well for integrated Windows Auth, and then generic header-based apps for your custom-based apps. Each one, new application appears as a new application in Okta, and then you assign the SSO and MFA policies as you would any other apps, and you assign users in exactly the same way using groups or assigning individuals. So your provisioning services can actually set this up as well, so that whatever processes you use today within Okta for provisioning, when allocating access to the apps, you can follow exactly the same process. So whether whether you're assigning apps using workflows or group policies or group rules, things of that nature, they can all work with exactly the same thing, but you can include that from a provision perspective. So in summary, before I move into showing you an example. So we're all about the journey from a complex hybrid IT environment, and it is a journey, and that's really the key message here. Okta helps you do that journey. Primarily from the cloud point of view, Okta's the leading cloud identity provider service. We've been there for 10 years, built in the cloud for the cloud, with very high availability and service level agreements. You've now got the ability to walk those on-premise environments through to Okta, but still support the on-prem apps where you can't move those in the first place. So we're really looking to focus replacement for traditional web access management solutions, which are Oracle Access Manager, CS SiteMinder, IBM Access Manager, the older Ping Federate Access and ForgeRock, which are still on-premise. So if you're wanting to reduce on-premise footprint, then this is definitely the way forward to do that. Moving back up a level, as I mentioned earlier on, one of the key focuses is remote access to critical business apps. And at the top layer, you've got this VPN approach. So user experience previously was open up device, get the VPN running, get on the network connection, do various other checks, log in through the VPN. Once you're into the VPN, you can then actually access all the different apps with typically very little control. But in terms of the app itself, if it's like the e-business suite and other things, you then have a separate user ID, password, and just the user experience is a challenge. Whereas the single sign-on delivered, and specifically for Oracle e-business suite, we have an additional component within the Okta Access Gateway called Rapid SSO, which allows us to eliminate the Oracle Access Manager and OID, so the Oracle Internet Directory is typically used alongside that. So ultimately, you can reduce quite a bit of the infrastructure and the mechanisms by doing that. And so I've got the system, I can actually show the example, but just that's a good example from a business perspective. To that point, so demonstration, quick run through. So I've got an application here, which is a traditional web application. It's broken up into sections. It's got pages of /secure, admin, anonymous, and you're right. So it's not like your single page apps or one page responsive apps, but they can be handled in a similar way, but from a policy perspective. So typically the anonymous side is we've got anonymous website, we've landed on the website, we don't know who the user is, but we'd like to personalize some of that information, or the user needs to gain access to a secure environment. So if I connect onto the secure side, I can then log in as a user, and you see there that I try to go to the website. So this is service provider initiated. And I've got a lovely demonstrator lady called Amy Thomas who's going to log in. We get the Okta logon box. It's familiar with what she's familiar with. So it's like we then have these sets of policies behind that says, right, for this user, please use this policy to log in. So in this example, even though Amy's account is an AD account, I'm actually using a passwordless experience using the Touch ID on my MacBook. So I've done the equivalent of a strong authentication into this. That's been done by Okta. Okta's generated the SAML assertion. That's been sent back to and then redirected Amy back to the application. The gateways then consumed that SAML assertion and broken out the information into header information, pass it across the app. The app is now showing us that header information that's come through. If I actually go to a special dump page, I can show you the actual raw header information that was sent across. And you can see lots of different things in there, but you can see here that we've got groups, we've got last name, first name, email address, there's IP addresses for forwarding purposes, various other things. But that's the raw information behind it. The app is just consuming that information and presenting it in a pretty format here. So we know from a personalization point of view, it's Amy Thomas. There is a user ID if we wanted to use that in some way for additional record matching or things of that nature. All these parameters are universal directory parameters passed across from Okta UD via the SAML assertion into the header information, including group information. So we have roles or groups here. So we can see that Amy's part of the sales team. She's part of the domain users projects. But if I try to go to the admin page, which is just another page, we can see an example here of the URL authorization. So Amy's not a member of the administrators group for this app, so she's not allowed access. That is straightforward. If Amy did have the appropriate group membership, she'd be allowed access to that. If I go to anonymous now, we can see because we've actually passed information across the app, we can actually do further personalization and say, oh, we now know this is Amy, even though we're on the anonymous page section. So that just shows you how the actual Okta Access Gateway works. The last section here is about URL rewriting. This is where the Okta Access Gateway will actually do URL rewrites. As you mentioned, if the internal DNS is not valid on the internet, then that's where URL rewriting comes in. We have to change those URLs that are referenced by the application on the inside to valid internet addressable URLs on the outside. And that's what URL rewriting is about. So that's a configuration again. Once the user's logged in, it's fairly straightforward, for instance, to gain access through single sign-on to other apps. So just an example, because Amy's already logged in, there's Okta now logging in, we can go to Salesforce cloud-based apps. For instance, Amy's going to be logging in there. It's exactly the same experience. We've got other example header apps. So here's the header app in a very pretty dump format. Shows you the result. This is the standard first app that we run on an Okta Access Gateway to prove it's actually working. And then we've got other example apps. So I've got another header app here that's going to simulate different environments, in particular Oracle. One of the challenges is that some of the particular group representation, we need to be able to change the separators. So by default, we use colons, but we can change that to commas or whatever we want to do. And you could even have scope type mechanisms which use a colon that's used by, say, modern RESTful APIs. We can pass some of that information across from that perspective. We mentioned about traditional apps. Here's a modern app. Here's a PWA. It's a mobile device. It's actually running through Okta Access Gateway, but it's quite happily. So it's not restricted to just older style apps. We can actually run more modern mechanisms through it as well if we needed to. So the chances are you'd actually run that, particularly from a mobile app point of view, you'd be running that through an API gateway most likely. But if there's a need to actually run some element of the microservices, for instance, through to a back-end environment, then Okta Access Gateway could be a way to do that. Just another example, we were talking about Enterprise Business Suite from Oracle. Here I am actually logged in. I think I'm still logged in. Let me just double check. Here's our Oracle Okta demonstration environment. And we can come to that and go to the classic EBS. I click on that link. Here's an example of a step-up authentication. Requires just another MFA on the basis of the policy. And we're then signing into Oracle Access through Oracle Access Manager through to EBS. And another example further down, I've got JD Edwards. If we clicked on that, you can see we're now doing single sign-on. But again, double check based upon the policy. We can again do access to, there's another example of a traditional J2E type web app environment. Okay, so that's the user experience side of things. I'm going to take a quick look at the administrator angle. So as I mentioned, from an administrator, it's very easy to do. So there's two parts to that. One is the actual administration interface. So if I log into this, you can see the administrator interface, fairly simplistic, because the main part of the administration we want to keep up in the main Okta administration interface. This one is specific to setting up the Access Gateway. And we can see the example apps that I was running here. There is actually definitions for each of those apps. So there's a topological view to start with. We then have a list of applications. We can add applications here from a catalog menu. And we can see example gateways, header-based examples, and Microsoft IWA or integrated Windows Auth examples, and then a range of Oracle built in. So we saw the EBS, we saw the JD Edwards one. We then got Quick, various other templated services. The admin UI is a SAML-based app. That's just what I've used just now. It's a good example of yet another application on the app. Within the applications, we saw what's going on. So if we actually look at this one, we can see the breakdown. So it comes into 3 groups of configuration settings: the attributes, which are the header-based attributes, the policies. The primary part here is this is where the DNS name mapping is done between the public domain side and the protected side. Public domain side is always HTTPS. We only support HTTPS as one protocol on the outside of the gateway. That's one of the reasons why it makes it secure. And every session that goes through the gateway has to be an authenticated session. The inside could be HTTPS or HTTP, depending on what the target application is supporting. So we set groups. This is an API-driven access into the Okta tenant. Come on. Yeah, and when you start typing and want to add groups, this will actually go and get a list of the actual groups that are available in Okta to be added into this. So it's very much an interactive configuration. We can manage certificates from this perspective, so you can add, and the gateway comes with its own single self-signed certificates to start with, but depending on your deployment configuration, you'd typically be using fully qualified internet accessible certificates, whether it's your own or in the front of the load balancers. There's configurations here for things like enabling URLs, session timers. We've also got some behaviors, what's going to happen in terms of an error condition, where's the error page we should go to. If the app is offline, what should we do about it? We can even put the Okta Access Gateway access part into maintenance mode. So we could say the application is under maintenance at present. So those are some key configurations there. As I say, the header information is the important bit. We've got header information, which the name value pairs. These come from Okta. And we saw groups, things you can just add new ones using the drop-down menu. Again, see the drop-down of all the Okta UD parameters. So that lists exactly what is in your Okta tenant. And then you just create new names for header values to map the naming convention that's required by the application. So this part's driven by the application, and that's how we actually mimic particular applications. And then we're into the policies, and we could see the breakdown of the policies from the not protected, the secure, the admin. The admin one was the example of URL. So we've got a policy editor and components. We specifically say here, you've got to be logged in with a role of OEG admin before you're allowed into this particular section of the app. So that gives us a quick tour there. From the administrator's perspective, the apps do appear just like any other app in the applications list. So when you've actually got your applications, we come down and we will see the example apps. So there's the app we were looking at. It looks exactly the same. We assign users. We have a sign-on policy with sign-on policies and potentially the MFA. The only difference is at the front door, the app will actually have specifically a set of SAML settings, and you will see the attribute list that's generated by the admin app. So, but you can change logos, you can do everything else from, as I say, signing on to assignments. That's all done from that perspective. So it makes life very easy from the administrator's perspective. Okay, so I think that's finished on the demonstration side. Let's go back to finishing up and just a summary of what we've actually been talking about. So key takeaways. As a hybrid IT project, one of the key elements of addressing is traditional web application apps and the ability there to do that. So Okta Access Gateway is a component of that hybrid IT solution capability. Helps us deliver that one identity provider for everything. So that one identity provider for everything for web. We've got the advanced server access to do SSH and RDP support. We've got the cloud support, and now we've got the on-prem apps using Okta Access Gateway, and therefore delivering that modern and secure experience. And we're providing a future-proof platform. We can get to those apps without making any significant changes to them. And we can provide an action plan. And the page was a bit keen to get to that. So looking ahead, there's some data sheets and things which I'm going to give you a link in that 2 pages. Review those heritage apps to work out, do they support header-based authentication? That's the critical bit. And then you can engage Okta and Okta partners in planning using Okta Access Gateway. And we've just got a high-level sort of replace legacy SS solutions roadmap. It's a multi-step process. Okta's deployed first, do your configuration. Then the critical part is actually if the web application management you're using today takes and supports SAML and federation, you federate between the two. So you can then actually have Okta as the front door for everything. Okta would then federate into the web application management and therefore gain access to those apps that are already there. And then over a period of time, you can actually move the apps through the Okta Access Gateway configuration so that they're actually running either side by side and then slowly switch over, or migrate them until the point you've actually got most of the apps off. Once they're all off, you can then look at deprecating the platform investments. But just a couple of last points really. Scoping the apps per integration type, that's the important bit, is you must have network pathways to it. So if it's Kerberos based, then part of the Kerberos environment needs to be set of that. If it's header based, it's great. There's also support there for cookies and a couple of other technologies built into the gateway as well. But it's rare, it's available, but less and less people are using that. If the app supports modern authentication, go direct. Work with Okta directly with using SAML, OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, things of that nature. You can look at reducing VPN usage, say point apps. If it's just one app or 2 apps you wanted to expose, rather than providing VPN access, you can expose those individual apps and have a tight group of who's actually available to have access to it. Part of that migration, integration and consistent single sign-on, very key. And then when take it a step further, you then build into that one identity provider across everything. To determine if a app is to be integrated, one good indicator is if it's using traditional web access management solution today. Those names, a reminder, Okta Access Gateway can replace Oracle Access Manager, SiteMinder, Ping, ForgeRock, IBM, and even some home-brewed, as long as it's using header-based authentication, then it's good for that. So it's been useful talking to you and presenting to you. This is Okta Access Gateway as part of a hybrid IT solution and the journey and the enablement to a single identity provider, cloud-based for the traditional web apps. Some additional reading and follow-up. There's a couple of white papers on the Okta website. There's a couple of blogs, and there's also some sessions that were recorded at the Octane event in April, which gives some examples of customers who've already done hybrid IT and reference points. So I'll leave that up there for a second or two, but if you can start to think of some questions you want, we'll be finishing that and handing back to Kristen.
Perfect, Kevin, thank you very much. That was really insightful. So if you do have any questions, please do submit them on the right-hand side of the panel. Alternatively, you can email tellmemore@bytes.co.uk. Now, I am cautious of time, and we do have a handful of questions that have come in, but I will just pick 1 or 2 now. Kevin, one that has come through is, does Okta Access Gateway work with custom on-premise apps?
Yeah, so as I say, just as I was finishing there, one of the things is to classify the applications. So home-built custom apps. Typically, if they've been configured to use a web access management solution or they've got a plugin module that does header-based authorization, then great. But if you end up doing any changes to the app or plan to do any engineering changes and you've got engineers available to do it, then we'd recommend you actually go down the route of enabling and updating the app to support OpenID Connect as the most modern method. But for those apps that you haven't got engineers at and it does header-based then and it's web-based, then Okta Access Gateway should be able to do it, but you'll need to do an assessment for each individual app.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so Kevin, what we will do is we'll wrap it up there to stick to time. Thank you all for attending, and if I can ask you to please fill out the survey when it does come through to you. It will only take a minute or so, and it does make a big difference to us in how we present to make it a better experience for you. So if I could ask you to please do that, we'd be really appreciative. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again.
Goodbye.